Good morning. It is so great to see all of you gathered with us today, and welcome to those who are with us online. It's been a real joy to share in this outpouring of praise to the one who has poured his love into our hearts, as we read in our scripture today. I'm so happy to be with you today. Have you ever gone to a wrecker service lot? Like, you know, the place where they take the cars that have been in accidents when they tow them away? I went to one of those this week. Unfortunately, it was not for fun. I was involved in an accident. Believe it or not, driving home from Wednesday night service, everybody was A-okay, which is what really matters. But I went to one of these places, the wrecker service lots this week. I got to tell you, it was kind of an eye-opening experience. So the place, it's like the size of a football field, this lot. And the cars in it, like if you can imagine, if you've ever been in Manhattan and you've seen like the places where they valet cars and they stack them up so close together that you can't even believe how they get them in and out of this lot, that's how this lot was. Just car after car after car, just piled up just inches away from each other. And I'm walking between these cars, following this man in a bright yellow safety vest, and his colleague is wheeling around this forklift kind of thing at full speed like it's a game of Mario Kart, and I'm really envious of the guy with his yellow safety vest. And I'm talking to this man as we're walking, and he's telling me that he works 100 hours a week at this lot. He works 2 24-hour shifts and 5 12-hour shifts week after week at this lot. And I'm following this man, and we're weaving through this maze of busted up cars. And the thing that I just keep thinking to myself is that, like, there's a story behind all of these. Like, every last one of them. And I was kind of just taken aback a little bit to see so much brokenness in one place. In a place like that, you really are confronted with a tough reality, and that is there's a whole lot of brokenness in this world that we live in. And just like every single one of those cars has a story of how it got there, all of us have a story too. But today, we're not here to talk about the fact of brokenness in our world. Because of the gospel, we don't have to stop there. For people of faith, we have reason for hope beyond just the brokenness in this world. Hope that cannot be broken. And because of that, as we began to say last week, we have every reason to be resilient. So last week we spent some time talking about this word on the screen here, resilience. And we talked about this man, Chris. We learned a little bit about his story. We also learned a little bit about Nehemiah and his story as well. And we saw how those two people were by no means insulated from adversity. Not at all. Each one of them faced challenges in their life to which there was no easy solution. Challenges in their lives that they didn't necessarily just cause themselves, and things that they could not solve by themselves. They were kind of like us in that way. But what Chris and Nehemiah had in common was this mindset, right? Chris was fond of saying 1% better every day. Nehemiah was fond of taking one more brick in each hand and keeping on going. That's what we call resilience, that kind of mindset. And that resilience in those two people's hearts was just like a huge deal for how their lives turned out and what they were able to accomplish. Well, today I want to come back to this topic, but just from a little bit different angle. So I said last week that we really need to have this in us as well. You know, as a church and as individuals, we really need resilience in our hearts to face the challenges that we face. And it can make a big difference in our lives if we have it. And we have good reason to have it as people of faith. That's what we said last week. But Today I want to dig a little deeper into that. I want to talk especially about why it is that we have good reason for resilience in our hearts as people of faith. Why is it that we can be resilient people? And for me, there's really no better place to see that than in the book of Acts. Here's why. You've probably thought of this before, but when was the last time you considered, how is it even possible that a movement like the Christian faith that started with just a handful of people and was led by, former fishermen and others who didn't really claim a whole lot of respect or authority in their world, how is it that a movement with that as its starting place could come along proclaiming a new king who just died publicly on a cross as a criminal in the very city that saw all this happen and in fact led to him being killed for fear of another king, the Roman king? How is it that all of those sets of circumstances for this cause could somehow become this international culture-spanning, turning the world upside down movement in just a few years' time? Like, without any of the technology we have today and all the travel that we're able to do today, how does that happen? Well, a big part of the answer to that is resilience. But it has to be more than just a good, resilient attitude, doesn't it? There's got to be more to it than that. And in fact, we find that there is. If there's any doubt of that, we see it in this passage I'm going to ask you to turn to. Acts chapter 5, the end of it, beginning in verse 34. In this passage, we find not just a resilient church, but we go deeper in that into their reason why they could be so resilient. And even the opponents of the growing church can see the power of this reason why. So if you haven't already, I'd love for you to turn to Acts chapter 5. We're going to begin in verse 34 here in just a second, but allow me to set the stage real quickly. So in Acts chapter 5, we're only a few chapters into the spread of the gospel in Jerusalem, but already you could say that this Christian movement has made quite a splash. So in Acts chapter 2, Peter preaches his first sermon, and you know that the response to that was amazing. Like 3,000 people were baptized that day, responding to the gospel message in the very city where Jesus had just been crucified a few days earlier. And it didn't just stop with that first initial baptism. Day by day, that number kept growing and kept growing and kept growing. There was a powerful impact going on. And in chapter 3, God works these miracles through Peter and John. They use this as an opportunity. They keep on preaching the gospel, and it keeps on growing and growing. By chapter 4, in the early verses, we see that 3,000 has now grown to 5,000. The movement is beginning to move. But for every single one of those successes in the early chapters of the church, there is also a challenge around every single corner. We're going to talk more about this later on. But suffice it to say for right now that as people are taking note of the gospel and responding, there are other people who are taking note and opposing it too. And not once but twice in the first 5 chapters, the leaders of the movement, Peter and John and the apostles, are arrested. They're imprisoned. They're brought before the authorities and they're told, no more of this. Cease and desist with your message. No more speaking of this Jesus. To which Peter and the others say what? Thank you, but no thank you. We're going to keep talking. about this Jesus. We must obey God rather than men, is what Peter says on behalf of everybody in chapter 4, and then again in chapter 5. And this show of resilience right here is what sets the stage for our key verses. So the church's enemies are enraged, verse 33, at the resilience of the apostles. When they heard this, what Peter said, they wanted to kill them. But just then, someone from among the adversaries to the church stands up and says something remarkable. His name was Gamaliel, a Jewish teacher. Later on, we learned that this Jewish teacher was the one who taught a young man from Tarsus named Saul, who's otherwise known as Paul, the Apostle Paul. So Gamaliel, this teacher, stands up and he speaks. And even though, for all we know, he's one of the group that opposes the church, he is the one who's going to name that reason why, that reason for resilience. Here's what he says. Men of Israel, take care what you're about to do with these men. For before these days, Theudas rose up claiming to be somebody, and a number of men, about 400, joined him, but he was killed, and all who followed him were dispersed and came to nothing. And after him, Judas the Galilean rose up in the days of the census, and he drew away some of the people after him, but he too perished, and all who followed him were scattered. You see, he's pointing to these two things that happened in history. There were these kind of people who tried to start up a movement. And in both cases, it really came out like a house of fire, and people were really drawn to it, but then, just as quickly, it fizzled out. Here's his point about all that. So in the present case of the apostles and the church, in the present case, I tell you, just keep away from these men. Let them alone. For if this plan or this undertaking is of man, it will fail. But if it is of God, you will not be able to overthrow it. You might even be found opposing God. Do you hear what he's saying when he says that? Gamaliel, who for all we know is not a believer, even he knows this. If this is just something that people rally around for a little while, then it's going to fade. And all of that resilience you see in Peter, who's standing up strong, and all the apostles with him, that's going to run out of steam. But if this is of God, then it doesn't matter how much you try to snuff it out. That fire is going to keep on burning. You can't stop it. Not now, not ever, no matter how much you might try. And isn't that our reason for resilience? Right there. The Apostle Paul, former student of Gamaliel, will later say basically this when he says in Romans 8, if God is for us, who can be against us? In this right there, we find our reason that we can face challenges with resilience. In this, we find the reason why, when afflicted, We are not crushed when perplexed. We are not driven to despair. When persecuted, not forsaken. When struck down, not destroyed. When we are grieved in our hearts, we don't have to grieve like those who don't have hope. When we fall down, we can get back up again. We can face our fears. We can name our worries. We can experience our struggles and not be overcome by them. This is the power of knowing that God is with us, putting our trust in that. So at the end of the day, the success of the church, it has to do with resilience, sure. But I think if we say that it's all about them just working really hard and, having this great attitude in them, and that's why they were able to overcome all these trials, I think that stops a little short of the point. It goes deeper than that. The reason they're able to stand, it comes from really knowing and trusting and believing in that reason why. They've come to see what Gamaliel sees. They've come to really believe it. In Acts chapter 5, they're trusting that if God is with them, and if they are with God, then God will not be stopped. And neither will his plans, and neither will his church. And I wonder if that's a message that we need to hear right now. Last week, we talked about needing resilience in our hearts and needing it in those very times when we face challenges, when faced with all of the brokenness that crashes into our lives in this world. We need that attitude, that mindset in our lives. I want you to go just one step deeper than that today. Beyond just the attitude we need, take it to the source itself. Your reason why. If we want to be resilient as individuals and as a church, like the church in Acts, we've got to remember this right here. The God who is with us. We got to remember that he's with us. And be sure that we're with him too. We've got to know what it means to put our faith in a God who overcomes. And we got to hold on to that. And practice putting our faith and trust in that God when we face those challenges in life that we face. And maybe if we do that, we might learn that that's part of why we face these challenges after all. Maybe that's part of what's going on there. The Israelites, we know from Scripture, were tested in their circumstances. Their capacity to trust in the God who helped them overcome so many struggles throughout the Scriptures was tested from time to time, and they had to learn and practice it, what they really believed. Can that be true for us as well? If it is, then we might need a little different metaphor than we used earlier. So when we started today, we were thinking about that lot with all the wrecked cars in it, all the bent-up metal and all the brokenness. Maybe a person of faith can think about things differently. Maybe people are not like those cars in the wrecker lot, and a lot more like metal in the forge of a blacksmith. I've been reading a book recently. It's by Todd Bolsinger. He talks about the art of blacksmithing. Has anybody here ever done any blacksmithing? Yeah, that's kind of what I thought. I don't see any hands. I know very little about blacksmithing. Certainly, I've never tried it. So if there is an expert here, I'm going to do the best I can in describing this to get kind of close. I hope I get there. Close does count, after all, in horseshoes. So it probably should count here with blacksmiths, too. I worked really hard to get around to that joke, and it wasn't worth it. When people are working as blacksmiths, there's kind of a 3-step process that they go through. It may be important to think about what it is. It starts with heat. They take that metal, maybe you've seen this before. I watched some videos to try to get a sense of what this is like. They take that metal and they put it in a heat so hot that when it comes out, it is just like glowing red hot orange and yellow metal. So hot that it can actually be bent and shaped with some force, right? But it does take some force. And so the next thing that you see is this hammering process where they take that metal that's so very hot and they put it down on this anvil and they just pound it into whatever shape it needs to be in, whether they're pounding it to be nice and thin or they're pounding it into a curve or whatever shape they want. That's what they're doing. They pound it with this hammer until it begins to take shape. And at the end of this here, it starts to look like whatever you think it ought to look like, right? It might look like it's done, but it's not actually done at this step. There's one more thing that has to be done, and it's called tempering. You know that word, tempering? It's a little more involved, this one, I think. But basically, it involves this process of heating it up again and then cooling it, and then heating it up another time and then cooling it, and this very controlled back and forth of just the right temperature here, and then taking it out of that temperature here and back and forth again. And through this process, the metal itself becomes stronger. It becomes less brittle. The metal becomes more resilient. Now compare that to the wrecked cars in the lot we were talking about earlier. You know, both of them involve metal crashing against metal, bending metals into shapes they weren't in before, loud and forceful collisions, steel against steel. But what they produce is just night and day different. And it's not at all hard to see why. In the hands of a blacksmith, the pressure and the heating and the pounding of metal is set to skillful use. And that tempering, that series of stresses, are stresses that make for strength. And when I read the book of Acts, I can't help but think about this happening in God's church. The church is being tempered like metal, tempered until it's strong, until it's resilient. So in Acts chapter 2, the church begins when the Spirit comes down in fire. And out of that first moment at Pentecost, the church is forged. And from that point forward, you see this back and forth happening over and over again in the first chapters. And so in chapter 3, there's this high point where they're preaching the gospel and they heal this man and everybody's praising God and they're coming to Jesus. But right after that comes a trial. Peter and John are arrested. Don't speak about this anymore. But when they get out of that, the church is stronger. They're praying together. They're sharing everything they have with one another. They're praying for boldness and rejoicing. And right after that, a problem from within. A problem that threatens the integrity of the church. They get through it. We see them continue to grow. God is working through them to heal people. And then comes another trial. The apostles are arrested again. It's the one we just talked about with Gamaliel. They throw him in prison. Don't preach about this anymore. But because of Gamaliel and what he said, they let him go. And so they go out rejoicing. They continue to spread the word. We could go on like this for a very long time. Chapter 6 is the same thing. There's another problem from within. They're not caring for the widows like they should. And so they elect the deacons. They appoint the deacons. And then they make it to where they take care of them and the church continues to grow. But then one of those deacons is arrested and they stone him and they kill him in front of everybody. And then the persecution gets so intense that it's actually pushing the Christians out of Jerusalem. It looks like the thing has just totally broken up. But it's not broken. It's not brokenness you see. It's tempering. And from that intense stress comes the spread of the gospel out of Jerusalem, into the cities and into the villages and into the towns, through every trial and challenge in Acts. God is working like a blacksmith in his shop, using those pressures, those stressors, those strains to make something stronger than before. God is tempering his people to be resilient so that they can stand and accomplish their purpose. And the great thing is, at every point in those challenges, we see the church come back to their reason why. They come back to the God who is with them. Like this one example I'll give you from Acts chapter 4. After Peter and John have been released and they see the threats that are all around them, they turn to God. They pray to God together. Look upon their threats, Lord. Give us boldness. And God does exactly that. When they had prayed, the place they were gathered in was shaken. They were filled with the Holy Spirit. They continued from that day in boldness. They came through that resilient. They came through it stronger than before. And maybe that's an example that ought to speak to us right now. In this world that bears so many signs of brokenness, we face many challenges as individuals and as a church. But could it be that God is tempering us, strengthening us, even through those very experiences? If God is able to do that, and we believe that he is able to do that, if God is able to do that, then what can that produce in us? We read a verse earlier from Romans about producing endurance and patience and hope that cannot be shaken. Is that what God's doing in us? And if God can do something like that in our lives, then it's all the more important we cling to our reason why. Our reason for resilience. So important that we put our trust in him, especially in our trials. For if God is for us, who can be against us? Maybe this is a message you need to respond to in your life today. Maybe in the midst of whatever's been going on in our world that is straining you, or in the midst of whatever's going on in your life, in your spiritual life. Maybe it's been hard to see that reason why we can keep getting back up again and keep being resilient and having hope. Maybe for others, in light of what God has done, in the strength that he gives us by being with us, you're ready to respond to the gospel and take hold of that in your life. Jesus said to preach the gospel in every nation, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. And he promised that he would be with us always through that, to the end of the age. However you may be called or challenged today, I invite you to seek that deep reason that we have to stand strong. While together we stand while we sing.